Father, we thank you for this opportunity to come together to office families, Lord, just to spend a little time, a moment together and in your word, and pray your blessing. For we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. A number of years ago, I took on the challenge of preaching through the book of Judges. Very interesting book. My habit has been as a pastor that I would preach in series. And largely it's been preaching books. And Judges is an interesting book for so many reasons. I'd say if it had a film rating, it would be R or 18. It is adult. I mean, it really is adult. And you know, when you're trying to preach a story about a Levite who cuts up a woman into 24 pieces and scatters her around, that's kind of a challenge on a Sabbath morning. And maybe the wisest thing would have been to ignore it, but always been one for a challenge, I said no. So Judges has always been fascinating. And one of the stories and one of the characters that I found very fascinating is that by the name of Jephthah. And of course, you kind of know the story of Jephthah. But you know, one of the things that I found interesting in his life was that, you know, he was the son of his father had a mistress. He was the son of a mistress. He was cast aside. And, you know, I don't know if any of you have any personal experience of growing up in that, but you can imagine the family dynamics when dad brings home, well, actually, she was a prostitute, when dad brings home a child and says, you know, I can just imagine Jennifer and me coming home with a little baby in my arms, and she's asked, who's this? It's my child. Who's it belong to? I don't really know her name, but you know, I paid for him. I mean, the whole thing was despicable. And of course, he was an outcast and he was thrown out of the home, blah, 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 blah. But basically, the story ends great because he ends up as the leader of his people. I mean, what is that? I mean, that is just fantastic. From outcast to leader. And in fact, the people voted for him to be our leader because they needed a fighter. And he had been fighting at home so much, he probably knew how to fight. Anyway, but that's what we don't remember, that bit. We just remember this bit. So let me read the bit we generally remember, which is Judges 11:30, and it reads, and Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, if you give the Ammonites into my hands, this is after he'd been made leader, Judges 11:31, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Then jumping down to verse 34, when Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of tambourines? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter, unlike his dad who was playing away. Verse 39, after the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. So, Jephthah's vow. Now, you know, when you read the story and you go to the commentaries and you look at Old Testament scholars, some have said, and there's big debates, well, no, he didn't burn her. He actually committed her to a life of celibacy, and that's how he dedicated her to, so, you know, and she had to go and live basically in a mountain like an Adventist, fleeing from persecution, but could have no relationship with any man or whatever. And I can understand that. I don't know, because I mean, there's a whole lot of problems with the story, whichever way you go. And I mean, for you know, yeah, it's just problematic. Did he burn her, or did he commit her to a life of celibacy, and so on? And somehow, to help us understand a bit about Jephthah's action, we should understand that in the Bible, vows were binding obligations and were never to be taken lightly. So, for example, here's what Moses said to Israel about making a vow to God. So this is found in Deuteronomy 23, where it said, if you make a vow to the Lord your God, do not be slow to pay it, for the Lord your God will certainly demand it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. Verse 22, but if you refrain from making a vow, you will not be guilty. So if you don't make a vow, it's not bad. Whatever your lips utter, you must be sure to do, because you made your vow freely to the Lord your God with your own mouth. So Moses was saying there's a revival carrying on right now in Kentucky. I don't know if you've seen it. It's been going on for about a week, I think, in Asbury, University of Kentucky. Literally, they've had a continual prayer meeting, and you can find it on YouTube. They've got live, and I was watching a little bit of it yesterday. I was like, the place is still rammed. Now you can imagine, in the spirit of the thing, people may be making all sorts of vows. Moses' warning was, it's better you don't make a vow, because then you're not guilty. Because sometimes you can get in the hype of a situation. I've been in church meetings where the evangelist has preached so powerfully, and people have so taken with emotion, and they give everything, and then they wake up in the morning and realize, you know what, I shouldn't have done that. Moses said, don't make a vow before God. And Solomon said, possibly with the story of Jephthah in mind, he wrote in Ecclesiastes 5, guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools who do not know that they do wrong. Which is interesting. He says that going to church. He said some of us offer the sacrifice of fools. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven, you're on earth. So let your words be few. As a dream comes when there are many cares, so the speech of a fool when there are many words. When you make a vow to God, Ecclesiastes 5:4, do not delay in fulfilling it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. And then here's verse 5. It's better not to vow than to make a vow and not fulfill it. So that's why I've said I do not make New Year's resolutions. Better not. Why? It's a nonsense. Now, interestingly, this whole vow thing gets even more interesting, because there are two kinds of vows in the Bible, and if I had better glasses, I could probably read it from this one. But, there are vows in Leviticus 27. The whole chapter is dedicated to vows, and you have different kinds of vows you can make to God. So you had a simple vow, which was in the Hebrew, and forgive the pronunciation, there. And then you had a more serious vow mentioned in Leviticus 27, known as a Karim. Now, the council of Leviticus 27 was given in the reality that God knew that we would make vows that we couldn't perform. And so God not wishing to discourage us from making vows, nor did he wish to release us from the vows that we already made, he actually provided a way in which we could commute the obligation. So in other words, he gave us get-out clauses in Leviticus 27. And so you could make various payments to redeem a vow. So it's kind of good, it's like treasury, it's you're moving from one pot to another pot. And God said, if you make a vow, we can do that. So according to God's plan, a vow could be redeemed by a money payment. And there's a prescribed scale there. So if your vow concerned a sacrificial animal, however, so if you vowed, I'm giving my cow or whatever, you couldn't convert that into money. That had to die on the altar. But other vows could be redeemed. And this is interesting. You see, a man, so I could go to church and vow himself, or I could vow my wife, or my children, or my slaves. animals, houses, fields, car would be today. And if the sanctuary couldn't receive the gift or the vow, they could work out on a scale, okay, so you vowed to give us this, okay, we'll convert it to X amount of shekels or pounds. So you could get out of it. But if it was the most serious of vows, which was the Karim, that was not redeemable. Yeah, it was most holy to God, and whatever you devoted, so and that was usually animals for sacrifice, it had to be put to death. There was no getting out of that. So coming back to Jephthah, he makes a vow, and we know it's a wrong vow. It's a sacred vow, yes, but it seems to me that Jephthah's vow, if he was about a burnt offering, he actually could have converted to money, quite simply, because it's in the prescribed scale. He could have said, okay, the priest could have identified, okay, she's worth X amount. That's it, pay the money, you're done. She can go along quite happily. And clearly Jephthah's vow was against what God had shared with Israel. They're never to perform human sacrifice. Which then leads me then, what is the redemptive nature? What is the redemption in this story? It's hard to find a redemptive quality, but maybe there is one. You know, Jephthah's name is mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. So maybe he didn't burn her. I don't know. I wasn't there. He's named in the roll call of faith. Be like Jephthah. And sure, we should follow his faith, but not his foolishness. The name Jephthah actually means whom God sets free. And really, he could have set free with a money payment his daughter. But maybe God made a rash vow. It's one that we take for granted. Jephthah could have released his daughter for 30 shekels, I reckon, from Leviticus 27 scale. But God made a vow to us, to humanity, to mankind. He made a vow to redeem us. But it couldn't be exchanged for money, even though Judas, as we studied in our lesson this morning, took 30 pieces of silver and said, yeah, that's about worth the life of Jesus. First Peter puts it this way, for we know that it was not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, that we were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to us from our forefathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for our sake. So it seems to me that God made a vow to redeem us that came at an unimaginable and unquantifiable price. The vow that God made in saving us meant his son had to die. Now, when Abraham was about to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice, he said to Isaac that God would provide himself a sacrifice. But here there was no get-out clause for God. He's going to redeem us, and it's going to cost his son. And no amount of money was going to get the father or the son off the hook in this one. You know, Jephthah clearly loved his daughter, and whatever that sacrifice involved, Jephthah's love wasn't enough to save her. The deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Ammonites came at a tremendous price. The price was his daughter. And so when we read those verses, or when we think of those simple verses, much recited, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. In a sense there, you see a father who loved us so much, but it wasn't enough to get his son off the hook. His love for us meant that his son had to die. And so it would take a death, a burial, and the eventual resurrection of Christ to set us free, to redeem us. God made a vow because he wanted us to be saved. Maybe his vow was irrational for the way that we've treated him and for the way that the world largely ignores him. But God made that vow because he very much loves us and wants to see us all saved, all of his children in his kingdom. So I hope you can think about that as you next make a vow or next sign a contract, as I just found out I did without realizing, without reading the small print. And now I have to pay £19 for something. I thought, what on earth is this? Anyway, that's another story. Be mindful of the vows and the contracts that you make.